Hi, I'm Jeremy Pressgrove, and I'm the coolest guy on this show. You're listening to the Happy Hippie Jesus Show with Jeremy, the coolest, and Bill.
You know, somebody that has to say they're the coolest, it's kind of like that person that has to convince people they're smart by telling them they're smart.
I'm just saying. On this show, height and coolness are related, and you're lacking in both.
I did not know that height had anything to do with coolness. I'm glad you informed me on that.
I mean, if I was short, I would try not to learn that too. All right, Bill. So we're diving into Holy Week.
In fact, we're starting Holy Week.
I don't feel holy yet, though.
No.
Is there anything like I need to do to make myself holier for Holy Week?
Do you have the Stations of the Cross at your church?
No. We're actually doing a Good Friday service with the Episcopal Church here in town. The 3 Methodist churches and the Episcopal Church are all going to do like something together on Good Friday.
Well, you know, you've got an Episcopal church. I bet you they're doing the Stations of the Cross. I would suggest going and doing the Stations of the Cross and meditating at each station. That might make you feel a little bit holier, or at least it might make you a little bit more reverent.
Well, I mean, I'll do that on Friday. I'm actually participating in that service. But between now and then, is there anything I need to do to make me holier today?
Eat Swiss cheese?
Ooh, well played. All right. So we're kind of diving in Holy Week, really, I guess for me at least, it begins with Palm Sunday, which is a unique time in our church. And there's some things about Palm Sunday, which I'm sure everyone's already heard, but are important.
But don't ask me what they are, because I'm not sure where you're going on this. So you've got to lead me. Because it might be a different important thing I'm thinking of.
Well, I'll let you say your different important thing next. But Palm Sunday for me is always this unique story. Jesus is entering the town, and I think it's important for all of us to understand that a large number of people are flooding into Jerusalem because they're preparing for the Jewish holiday of the Passover. So there's all these people coming in to get ready to go to the temple and to participate in the Passover. And I've always been struck by this idea that there's this crowd chanting, "Holy, holy, holy," and putting down palm leaves for Jesus. And then a week later, a crowd's yelling, "Crucify him." But it's really two different crowds.
I was just going to say, there is an argument to be made that they are two different crowds.
Exactly.
The ones chanting "Holy, holy, holy" are actually Galilean, and the ones shouting "Crucify him" are actually Judean.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction for us to remember as we go in. Because sometimes I got the impression growing up that, like, these people are just crazy and they've got, like whiplash because they keep changing their minds so quickly, but it's actually two different groups. Or there's at least a strong argument to be made that it's two different groups. And I think that provides us some clarity and also a little bit of insight into there's tension in Israel between the Judeans and the Galileans, or these different groups. Much like, there's tension in the U.S. along like geographical lines as well. And it's this influx of people coming in, and that I think contributes in some of the ways that people in the Jewish temple respond to Jesus as well. In a lot of ways, they view him as an outsider because he's not one of them. He's not a Judean or not from Jerusalem. So what was your fun fact about Palm Sunday, Bill?
I don't know if it's fun or not, but Jesus is making a political statement in this story. Jesus is riding in on a colt, and this is a tradition, a rule that's not something that shows up in our world, but does show up in the world of first century Judaism, is that no one was supposed to ride in through the gates of Jerusalem except for the ruler. And here is Jesus riding in on this colt or this donkey, whatever it is, depends on which gospel you're reading. And as he is riding in, what's most likely happening on the other side of Jerusalem is Pilate and Herod are riding in at the same time. And Jesus is flanked by peasants throwing down their cloaks and palm branches, which they were actually probably olive branches. And on the other side, here comes Pilate and Herod, flanked by a Roman legion. I mean, you can just feel the drama right there, because essentially what is happening here is Jesus and the Galileans are declaring that Jesus is king and not Caesar.
Yeah. And I've got to tell you, I imagine Caesar looked more like what we expected a king to look like. The giant chariots, the soldiers in armor. There was every bit of the force and the pomp and the circumstance were with him. And Jesus is having kind of like a poor man's parade over there with, some kids tearing palm leaves off trees and riding on this little colt, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the world turned upside down.
Which is how our Holy Week begins.
Yes.
God's world doesn't look like what we expected, or God's kingdom doesn't look like what anyone in the first century expected, right? They expected Jesus to pull a Pilate, to establish an army and run out the Romans and to set up this big, beautiful physical kingdom.
Right. And what we essentially get all through Holy Week is this challenge of God's kingdom versus empire. And throughout Holy Week, we watch how God's kingdom works as opposed to how empire works.
Yeah. So what's your favorite example of that during Holy Week?
Gruesome enough, it is the crucifixion. Because the way that empire works is it asserts its power. It demonstrates that you cannot stand up against it because it will knock you down. In fact, if you stand up too much, it will kill you. Whereas God's kingdom works on self-sacrifice.
So empire is Pax Romana, peace through victory.
Well, that's one aspect of empire.
Certainly. But victory is very important in empire.
Yes.
And force.
Force, yeah.
And power. What else is going on during Holy Week that stands out to you?
Neither one of us came from a tradition that participated in Holy Week. So it was
true.
Really new for me. And the one that just really confused me at the beginning, and tell me if this confused you or not, was Maundy Thursday. I was so confused by Maundy Thursday. And because we're in the South, and I'm listening to my senior pastor the first time I'm really hearing about Maundy Thursday, and I think he's saying Monday Thursday. And I'm like, what is he talking about? Is he having a stroke?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but like the very first time I had to go home and Google Maundy Thursday to know what it meant.
Right, yeah, I did too.
I was like, what is this stuff? And it's, Maundy comes from kind of the Latin translation of commandment, which means that Jesus is saying, he's giving them new commandments on that Thursday as they kind of enter into that time together. And that's a really significant day. And maybe another example of God's kingdom not working the way that empire works. Jesus gathers them all together and starts by washing their feet, which is really countercultural, or an upside down way of looking at it, that the leader would take on the role of the servant and wash the feet of the people that were supposed to be following him or under him. And then they go into that meal together, and ultimately Jesus sets up communion at the end of that, or what becomes our communion ritual with the Last Supper. So what about that day jumps out for you?
Well, because Maundy is a new command, what really jumps out for me is the new command that Jesus gives to the disciples beyond the Last Supper. And the new command was, I give to you this new command. Love one another as I have loved you, and that's how people will know you're my disciples. Man, that just jumps right out at me. It's such a beautiful command, and it is also maybe one of the most difficult commands that Christ ever gives.
Yeah, I was going to say, as Christians, we've been crushing that one ever since. I mean, we've just knocked it out of the ballpark. It sank right in.
I think we said in another podcast recently that the only commandment that humanity has fully embraced and lived out was go forth and multiply.
Yeah, we were good at that one. Yeah. This love thing. It takes some more work.
Yeah. Well, that does involve love.
Yeah. So is there anything else about that, I guess, night or that meal or that time together that stands out for you?
Well, let's talk about who was at the meal, because I think that's important.
Judas,
yeah. Judas was at the meal. What does Judas end up doing? I mean, Judas ends up betraying Jesus. And it's not like Jesus doesn't know.
Yeah.
I mean, he's letting everybody at the meal, including Judas, know the whole time, somebody's going to betray me. I know who it is. I'm not going to tell you who it is because, and this is the reason I think Jesus does not let anybody know who it is that Jesus loves Judas so much, he wants to enjoy one last meal with him, even though Judas is going to betray him. And if he had revealed that it's going to be Judas, the other disciples would have chased him out.
Yeah, they weren't too thrilled.
No.
And let's just own that none of the disciples had their best week.
No, none of them did.
I mean, they might not all of them betrayed Jesus, but certainly all of them had moments they wanted to take back that week. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times. The rest of the disciples basically run away and hide when he's arrested. None of them seem to know what's going on or what's happening.
Yeah.
And they all have moments of guilt and doubt and regret. And maybe it's striking for me, Judas is there, but none of them are living out their best selves or behaving their best that week. And Jesus loves them all anyway.
But how many of us, when we come to communion, have lived out our best selves that week?
None. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what's beautiful about communion. It's this place where we get to come and lay everything at Jesus' feet, all our sins, all our brokenness. And Jesus looks at us and says, let's eat. Mm-hmm. Join me here. Let's have a meal together.
And I think it's just important to own that was the reality for those original disciples as well. They were lost and broken and confused.
Yeah. There was another person at the Last Supper. This person only shows up in the Gospel of John. Who is that?
Oh, I didn't know it was Bible Trivia Day.
Yeah. This one's an easy one because this is one that only shows up in the Gospel of John, all throughout the Gospel of John.
Is it his mother?
No. This one doesn't have a name.
Well, I only know people with names.
The beloved disciple. Okay, the beloved disciple. The one whom he loved. And I bring that up because a lot of people say that the beloved disciple is John. But we have no scriptural basis for that, right? But there is one theory of who the beloved disciple is, and that is the reader, the person reading the scripture. And I bring that up because in the Gospel of John, in the Last Supper story, if we accept that theory, then we get to take part in the Last Supper. We get to take part in having our feet washed. We get to take part in Jesus praying over us.
I thought you were really going to go Dan Brown on me for a minute.
No.
And it was going to be some crazy Da Vinci Code, and I was like, oh, man. Oh, so that's an interesting theory. I don't think I've heard that one. So tell me a little bit about what you know. Where did it come from? How did you get acquainted with it?
I can tell you how I got acquainted with it. I can't tell you where it came from. I got acquainted with it from my New Testament professor in seminary, Dr. Mitzi Minor, because she went over all the different theories but didn't tell us where they all came from. It was a survey course, obviously, so we didn't dive too deep into it. But the theories are, one, that it is John, because he's the writer, and he's trying to be modest by not saying his name when it's the beloved disciple. Two is that it is the reader. And the third theory is that the beloved disciple is Lazarus, because in John, when Lazarus dies, when his sister, I believe it's Mary, says this, greets Jesus, says, Lazarus, the one you love, has died. And that's the only person referred to that way in the Gospel of John. And then my professor's own personal theory, and that's because there's nothing there for this, but I really like it, is that the beloved disciple is Mary Magdalene. But then it blows up when you get to the sequence with the tomb, because Mary Magdalene goes and tells.
I'd like to float a new theory for you.
Sure.
That it is, in fact, the author, and they're being the exact opposite of modest. But it's John. He's like, look, Jesus loves me best. I'm the favorite.
Why didn't he say, me, the beloved disciple.
Because everyone that read it in the first century already knew, and it didn't occur to him that it would become like some part of a Bible that we would be reading thousands of years later.
Oh, yes. The other piece of evidence for Lazarus is that at the end of John, when Jesus is forgiving Peter, you know the sequence where Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" You remember that, right? Peter looks.
And Peter says, "You know I love you."
Exactly. And after that's done, Peter looks and says, "Well, what about him?" and points to the beloved disciple. And it says something like there had been a rumor that this disciple would not die. And because Jesus had resurrected Lazarus, it's possible that that is the beloved disciple.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan Brown.
Just because your seminary professors didn't teach you anything about John doesn't make me Dan Brown.
I'm just saying. All right. So what else is going on during Holy Week that we need to talk about? You've got Maundy, Thursday. We've talked about Palm Sunday. There's a couple of events between Palm Sunday and Maundy, Thursday.
There is Good Friday.
That comes after, not between. But yeah.
Oh, between. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Well, tell me of these events. Tell me of these events.
I guess the two most significant is Jesus cursing the fig tree, and then Jesus getting into this little dispute with some money changers in the temple, right?
Oh, you're talking about within the scripture, not specific days in the Holy Week tradition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just the Bible.
Okay, just the Bible. I was confused. I thought we were talking about days within Holy Week, since we were talking about Holy Week. But that's okay. Go ahead.
I mean, we should start like Fig Tree Monday.
Fig Tree Monday.
We could make it like a new Holy Week tradition.
But see, here's where that breaks down for you. The fig tree gets cursed before he clears the temple. Hey, this is Bill here. Jeremy's actually right in this segment about the order of the stories, but watching him doubt himself was kind of fun. But he is definitely wrong about the cursing of the fig tree being a specific day celebrated during Holy Week. Now back to the show.
So we'll have Temple Tuesday and Fig Tree Monday. I mean...
Well, the temple comes immediately after the triumphal entry, as in Palm Sunday. So the cursing of the fig tree happens before Palm Sunday.
I know, but we got to spread it out. We got a whole week to fill here.
Yeah, but it doesn't even happen in that week.
It happens on Sunday.
Okay.
He enters in. He curses a fig tree. He clears out the temple.
No. He curses the fig tree. He enters in. Then he clears the temple.
Are you sure?
I'm pretty sure.
I heard a rumor Paul fell off a horse.
Because he was leaving Bethany when he cursed the fig tree. And Bethany's outside of Jerusalem.
All right, well, I'm just going to be quiet then, because clearly you know more about the Bible than me.
But you could be talking about John, the Gospel of John, because in the Gospel of John, Jesus clears the temple at the beginning of his ministry.
What?
In the Gospel of John, Jesus clears the temple at the beginning of his ministry, not at the end.
Interesting.
This is Bill again. This is true. The clearing of the temple happens in John chapter 2. Now back to the show.
Why is that significant in John's gospel?
John theologically is trying to establish Jesus' divinity. And part of his divine claim is having authority over the temple. And so John chooses in his writing to move that event towards the beginning of his ministry to establish that right at the beginning.
Yeah, and John's gospel is unique from the other three in, I guess, a number of ways. And one of those most significant is he spends a great deal of time talking about both Holy Week, the crucifixion, and then tells all the resurrection stories. Whereas the other three tend to focus more on the life and teachings of Jesus.
Correct, but I was just trying to help you out with not knowing the Bible.
Well, I'm afraid there's no help for that. But if your theory is correct that the authors were not necessarily trying to tell them in, chronological order or the dates that they happened, but were moving them to give a story, then I maintain that Fig Tree Monday and Temple Tuesday could have happened.
In the Gospel of Jeremy, yes.
I should write that gospel. It'd be brilliant. What is the significance of clearing the temple? I guess you mentioned in John it's establishing authority over the temple.
Correct.
And that kind of part of Jesus' claim to divinity. What else about it to you?
The other Gospels, it really has to do more with the corruption that has occurred in the temple. And that's the whole reason that Jesus curses the fig tree. When Jesus comes to the fig tree, it's not even the season for figs.
Yeah, but a fig tree has significance in ancient Judaism that we don't understand.
Right, because figs were a luxury item for the rich. And so Jesus curses this fig tree for not bearing fruit. Well, the temple was now a tool for the elite, for the powerful. For instance, you no longer had the Levites as the priest. Now the priests were assigned or appointed by the governors that were appointed by Rome, and they used their power and influence to get that position. One particular chief priest made it a law that you could only sacrifice a lamb that came from Bethlehem, and you had to buy it from Bethlehem. Well, guess who owned all the livestock in Bethlehem? That chief priest. You see, and so it had become a corrupt system. Instead of being subject to God, they were now subject to Rome instead.
Yeah. So if you're in the first century and you're one of Jesus' disciples and he curses the fig tree and then storms into Jerusalem, you think it's on, right?
Oh, yeah. And the interesting thing is the place where Jesus curses the fig tree, it's just outside of Bethany, up on the Mount of Olives, and that point on the Mount of Olives looks right down on the temple. So it would almost be like a crosshairs that you were looking through that fig tree, aiming right at the temple.
Yeah. So they think it's on, and he's about to go, and he goes and he clears the temple.
Yeah, and
you think, oh man, new kingdom.
That's
Here
right.
we go.
We're going to start it now. Get your clubs and get your spears.
But that's not what happens.
No.
To the great shock and disappointment of all of his disciples.
Despite the fact that Jesus had been telling them the whole time, this is what's going to happen.
You make it sound like you're any better at listening to Jesus.
What'd you say?
I said, you make it sound like you're any better at listening to Jesus than they were. There's one thing you learned. It's God's got to tell us again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah, and that's why we celebrate Holy Week again and again and again and again, because we still don't get it. I mean, we're still looking for this God that's going to come down with, Rambo God. It's going to come down and use God's power to just wipe out the corrupt, wipe out the evil. And that's not how God works.
Yeah. But we still don't get it, huh?
No.
These things happen.
So what other event do you want to add to Holy Week that doesn't actually appear in Holy Week?
Let's see. I'd like to just insert the woman at the well randomly, just for fun.
No.
How about Paul? Paul claims to be an apostle. Can I put him into Holy Week randomly so he can be with the other apostles?
No. You cannot put Paul in either.
Oh, well then maybe we'll just kind of stick to it.
Why don't we go get Timothy and drag him in?
Well,
he wasn't even born yet.
I was going to say, Timothy's like 12 when Paul goes into ministry. He would. Oh, no. Why don't we just stay there?
Okay.
So they have the Last Supper together, Maundy, Thursday, and then there's this exit into the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah. The whole sequence in the Garden of Gethsemane got a whole new meaning to me, all new life after I participated in my first Seder. Have you ever participated in a Seder meal, Jeremy?
I can't even spell Seder meal.
I would, but I'd spell it wrong. Okay, a Seder meal basically is a Passover meal.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fancy word for it. That's all. It's the Passover meal. And it's got all these different sections throughout the meal where questions are asked and stories are told and rituals are performed. But at the end of each section, you are to drink a glass of wine. And tradition is it's not you take a sip of your wine, you just down it. And so by the time you finish a Seder meal, you're somewhere between 5 and 8 glasses in. Right?
We'll just pause and say, I'm starting to see why Bill thinks so highly of this meal. Yeah. But carry on.
Well, we did it in our church, and it was grape juice. But it wasn't at the Last Supper. So when we get to this scene where Jesus goes off to pray, and he tells his disciples to wait for him, and he keeps coming back, and they're asleep, I tend to understand a little bit more now. I mean, after 8 or 9 glasses of wine, you're going to be a little sleepy too. You're just sitting there in the dark and you're just nodding off and nodding off. And it's those moments where there's a little humor there, but the disciples become so human in that moment. And everything becomes so real in that moment when you have a realization like that.
Yeah. So the Garden of Gethsemane took on meaning for me when we went to the Holy Land, or when I went to the Holy Land for the first time. Because you can go to the traditional spot of the garden, and from there you can sit and you can look down and you can see the old city walls and the gates that the soldiers would have most likely come out of. And I can just see and think about it at night. You see the torches. You would have seen the torches coming the entire way. And it's dark all around as they're coming out of the gates and up to arrest Jesus in the garden. And Jesus can pray and just watch them come. And there's this knowledge that in the middle of the night, he could have slipped away anytime he wanted. But he just keeps sitting there. And I just sat in the garden, and I just couldn't imagine like sitting there and watching the group of people that are going to come arrest you and ultimately kill you. And Jesus clearly doesn't want it to happen. He's begging, to let the cup be passed from him. And he's watching and knowing that it's coming and that he can escape. And I don't know, I just found that really overwhelming in that moment to just sit there and just say, man, he was literally watching them march out to arrest him. And he stayed.
Okay, your realization, much deeper than mine, and almost makes up for you not knowing your Bible and sticking the fig tree after the triumphal entry. I'll have to say that.
Well, salvation is a matter of the heart. So.
It is.
But it is like a really moving story or moment that, oh man, this is happening. And he's watching it as he prays. And he's watching the torches get closer as he prays. And it's just like, ooh. It adds a little bit of that urgency and that edge that you get in reading the gospel accounts.
Yeah. Now, for me in the Holy Land, when we went to Caiaphas's house, and this was with you, because I didn't get to go down into this in my last trip.
And Caiaphas was the chief priest during the time of Jesus.
That's right. He's the one that had Jesus arrested. And they bring Jesus to Caiaphas's house, and they beat him up. They question him. And there's this spot in Caiaphas's house that was a dried up cistern that they believe was the cell that they lowered Jesus into. There was just a hole that they would have just dropped him down through. And he would have dropped about 10 feet. And while we were in there, because we were a small group when we went, and this was what was wonderful about that was I found this spot in the cell where the stone almost was shaped like the indentation of a body, and I laid down in it. And I could just imagine being battered and bruised, laying on that stone and feeling the coldness of that stone. In one sense, feeling the relief from the cold, but the searing pain of being on stone after being beaten and bruised.
Yeah, it's a realization that, this was not a pleasant experience. And there was there's real pain and suffering that maybe sometimes we can gloss over or forget. Mm. And also at Caiaphas' house, you have the story of Peter that we alluded to earlier.
Correct. In so many of the stories of Peter, we tend to judge Peter too harshly. Peter just watched his master being arrested, just watched his master being beaten. He is a poor peasant person that has been stepped on and pushed around his entire life and felt no power. And here he is at the chief priest's house on the patio, watching the person he loves the most in the world being beaten and abused, and someone accuses him of knowing Jesus in that moment.
Yeah.
He had to be terrified, and I dare say there would be very few of us in that moment that would go, oh yeah, I know that guy, let me go in there and get beat up too now.
Oh yeah. Peter, for me, like, Peter's just an emotional person, and oftentimes in the Gospels, his emotions kind of get the better of him for better or worse. He'll have these overwhelming kind of responses because he'll do or say things maybe before his brain catches up. And I can relate to that. And we all know like a Peter to some extent that does something and then thinks about what they did, or says something and then thinks about what they said. And as we get that several times with Peter, and I don't hold that against him. I think he's just human, and he's just being human.
And it's one of the things that makes him the leader he is. Somebody that thinks about what they're going to say before they say it is not going to jump up at Pentecost and preach the sermon he did to a bunch of people that are accusing them of being drunk, or stand before a court and say the things he said. Because anybody that's thinking it through is like, I'm potentially going to start a riot, or I'm just digging myself a deeper hole.
Yeah. There's something I say a lot, and people in my local church hear a lot. The best of us can be the worst of us. And the very best things about us can also become the very worst things about us. And it's not, like polar opposites, but they're closely related. Peter reminds me a little bit of Moses as well, if we're going to make an Old Testament reference. Like, Moses was also an emotional guy, and there were times that his emotions got the better of him, like when he, kills that Egyptian soldier as a teenager. And it's also that passion and that emotion that gives him the ability to lead the Israelites. And there's times where, like, Moses just passionately pleads to God for the Israelites. Someone thinking that through doesn't try to bargain, with God, like with this emotional plea or about,
Exactly. I mean, and Moses is also the same one that had pleaded with God to save the Israelites, but then turned around and said, just kill them all. Just kill them all, because I'm tired of these people. Yeah.
I mean, as someone who's read, Exodus fairly recently, I understand where he gets fed up. They were kind of annoying. But yeah. So yeah, we have the arrest and all of that. So what does Good Friday kind of come to mean for you? Do you do anything at your church, or do you have any church services around it?
We do have church services around it. Now, this is only my second year at the church, and we kind of switch back and forth. One year, we'll do Maundy, Thursday in our contemporary service, and Good Friday in the traditional service. Well, last year, my first year here, we did Good Friday in the contemporary service. So we did something very different. And so I'm really not sure what the tradition is. I'm looking forward to seeing some of it this year in the traditional service. Mm-hmm. But in the past, one of my favorite parts of Good Friday is the stripping of the altar, is taking all the paraments off little by little and leaving in the darkness.
Yeah, I don't want to bust you up here, but the altar's traditionally stripped on Maundy, Thursday at the end of the service.
No, it's stripped on Good Friday.
That is incorrect. I will point you to the Book of Worship, page 67. I don't actually know the page number, but it is, I've seen it done at both.
Yeah, it can be done in either one, but that you asked me what I like about Good Friday. I'm telling you what I like about Good Friday. I
know. I just wanted to mess with you because you made fun of me for not knowing the Bible.
I like eating bread on Hawaiian bread on Maundy, Thursday. Okay, I mean, dipped in juice.
That's also very biblical. Jesus served Hawaiian bread because it's delicious.
If there was Hawaiian bread, Jesus would have served it.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't serve Hawaiian bread if given the chance?
Exactly.
I mean, I don't in my current setting, but we'll just put that aside.
That's neither here nor there, right?
Exactly. Ask you this: Because you just came back from Israel. Did you walk the Via Dolorosa?
Yes, I did walk the Via Dolorosa, but we did it so hurriedly. Because we had such a large group, we had to just really rush through it. It took us 20 minutes to get off the bus every day. So you can imagine how long it took us to get through the Via Dolorosa. So we rushed through it. But what's your question? Maybe I can answer it.
I was just going to ask, did anything about that stand out for you? About walking the path of the cross?
Not this time, because this time I was taking up the rear, getting people caught up, trying to keep them with us. So I missed out on most of the Via Dolorosa. But when I went with you, I'll refer to that. That was very moving, to stop and be there where Simon traditionally relieved Jesus of the cross. That spot on the Via Dolorosa where they traditionally say Jesus stopped to take a rest and placed his hand, and I placed my hand in that spot. Those were very moving moments for me. Now, there are a couple of spots in the Via Dolorosa that are part of other traditions that don't show up in the Bible, and those aren't quite as meaningful to me. But maybe if I'd grown up in those traditions, they would be.
Yeah.
I did think it was interesting, though, that the spot where Pilate judged Jesus is now a school for boys. Do you remember that?
If I knew that, I had forgotten it.
Yes. It's a school for boys now, so I don't know what that means or anything, but it is interesting.
Yeah. Maybe the thing that stood out for me the most the last time I walked the Via Dolorosa was the artwork at all the different, a number of these sites have become Catholic churches over the years, or they have built churches around them. And I remember I was walking it with my wife, and we have 2 little kids, and Mary is in all the art. And you could just see like Jesus's mom and her distress. And maybe in those moments, the humanity of Jesus really hit me. Like Jesus was, Jesus is God, or the Son of God, or however you want to word that out, a third of the Trinity. But Jesus is also fully human. In those moments, like you're walking, you're like, Jesus had a mom who was watching this happen. Jesus had friends that loved him and were watching him die. Jesus was suffering, and people that loved him were suffering because they were watching all these things happen to him. And I found those moments really touching and really moving, just to think, oh man, I couldn't imagine like being Mary in those moments, or I couldn't imagine being Jesus's friend in those moments. And I couldn't imagine the suffering and the anguish that goes through watching someone that you love and care about walk that path and ultimately end up on a cross. So that was the moving part for me the last time I was there.
There was an interesting moment for me this time at the Church of the Condemnation. There's a spot in that church where the original pavement from the old city of Jerusalem is still there, and you can see scratched into that pavement a game that the Roman soldiers played. And to think, while all this is going on, there are soldiers just over there playing a game. Mm-hmm. As if nothing significant is happening. It's just it's a very human moment, but it's a very humiliating moment in the same, because we miss so much as human beings. We miss the significant sometimes when it's going on right around us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they take Jesus down from the cross and they place him in a tomb. And 3 days later, the Easter Bunny appears.
Oh, that's exactly what happens in the Gospel of Bill.
Yeah, no.
Which is in the Bible right after the Gospel of Jeremy.
Right, yeah. But, you'd almost
with
think so.
Monday.
You'd almost think so, the way we treat Easter sometimes. But so we've come to the end of Holy Week is Easter Sunday. I don't know, Holy Week's so much different than Christmas for me. At Christmas time, we go through the season of Advent, and I don't really get into the Christmas spirit until the last Christmas Eve service is done. I don't know if you experienced that or not. But Lent and Holy Week I can feel through the whole time.
Lent feels different. Lent is intentionally different.
Right.
And I'll just say, for me, I find the Christmas spirit between Advent 4 and Christmas Eve, when everyone's supposed to.
Well, it's usually just we're so busy as pastors during Advent that it's not until we say, you know, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and dismiss everyone, that I'm like, I can breathe now and enjoy the season. You know?
No, but
thank goodness we've got 12 days of it.
Yeah. No, Lent does have a very different feel than Advent. And that's intentional. And that's part of our Christian calendar and our Christian tradition. And I guess we didn't really talk about that a lot. But, I mean, Lent is a time to reflect on our own mortality and our own sinfulness and our own kind of need of a Savior. And it's a time to prepare for Easter, which is very different than the purpose of, you know, Advent, which is a joyous celebration about Jesus coming. So they do feel different, and they should feel different.
But what I'm saying is the busyness doesn't rob Lent of its power. Where sometimes the busyness that we have as pastors robs Advent of its power.
Interesting. Okay, I can see that.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've come to the end of our time. We've made it to Easter, and I hope that everyone out there has a wonderful Holy Week, and that you make the best of it.
So, Bill, before we go,
all right,
what's saving your soul this Holy Week?
The weather right now, man. You heard at the beginning of the podcast the birds chirping. I tried to record outside till the heat shut off my computer, and I had to come back inside. But the weather is saving my soul at the moment, but it's killing my sinuses.
All right. Sunshine is good for your soul.
Yeah.
I think there's science.
Yes. What's saving your soul today?
Yeah, the weather has been beautiful. I don't know what is saving my soul today. Just my friends, my people this week. We had a long talk yesterday, I guess in a Bible study, about community and the need for community. And I'd say that realization is saving my soul this week. My community, my church, my tribe that I do life with.
Oh, that's sweet, Jeremy.
So why don't you tell everybody what projects you're working on and where we can find you on social media?
Right now, I'm contemplating many projects. You can find me on the Facebook at the Happy Hippie Jesus Show page. You can also find me on Instagram at the Happy Hippie Jesus Show Instagram account. And you can also... Let me look up your phone number, and I'll just give it out real quick. Hang on a second.
Yeah, I mean, because you cannot find me at any of those social media sites because Bill does all the work. All right. Take care, Bill.
Take care. Have a week.
You too.